So you can say good morning back. It's all right. I can take it. My name is Nate Ingvoldstad, and I'm the pastor here of Mission and Outreach. So basically, if you don't know what that means, I get coffee for Phil and Matt. Phil's 2 creams and a sugar. Okay. In all seriousness, I'm excited to be a part of the story of hope with you guys as we teach through God's story. It's exciting to me because this is something that Megan and I were able to teach as we were missionaries there on Barangunan Island in the Philippines. So we saw as God's story was progressively revealed and people understood just the change and the power that we saw happen in people's lives. And so as we get to take part of that with you guys, studying together as we go in your home groups and then here at our time in church, just really a privilege to do that with you guys. Does everybody have a book? Everybody got one that needs one? If anybody needs a book or possibly notes, you raise your hand. First of all, let's go for books. Anybody need a book? Book. One book in the back there, Eric. Two. Anybody over here? In the back? The 2 more in the back there, Bruce. We're just running out of these. That's good. Okay, now who needs notes? If anybody needs notes, get your hands up here. One in the front. All right. And the next thing is we do have these available, these note cards. So I know Phil's been pushing them from the front. I believe we have some left still. If you want note cards, come see me or Phil after the service. They're $20. Little warning though, as you go through them with your kids, the kids get pretty good, so they will pick out your mistakes if you make them. Not that we make them, but they get good. So pick up those if you'd like. And if you remember, where we left Adam and Eve at last week, right? We left them at a very pivotal moment in history, in the history of the world. They had been in a garden called Eden. And in this garden, they'd had perfect relationship with God. They had no sin. Life was perfect for them there. No hunger, no fear, no anger, no pain, no sickness. A perfect relationship with God, with each other, with the world around them. And then this happens. The deception, right? God's enemy, his adversary, Satan, who used to be called Lucifer, right? He was one of the angels who dwelled in heaven. So Lucifer, whose name meant bright morning star, was thrown out of heaven because he wanted to be like God, right? And his sin and his hubris tried to become like the one who created him. And so God throws him out of heaven along with a third of the angels down to the earth. And Satan, okay, God changed his name from Lucifer to Satan, meaning adversary, right? The one who's against God. He comes into the garden, and we're not sure if he takes control over a snake or he comes in the form of a snake, but somehow he comes to Eve, and he poses some lies and some trickery to Eve, and Eve takes the bait and grabs the fruit that was forbidden in the garden, and she eats it. And as she eats it, she shares it with her husband, Adam. And then sin begins to permeate the world. And we see this right away in the brokenness of their relationship. Right? Adam and Eve, one of the first things they do is they make coverings. Right? They're ashamed of even to be with each other, ashamed of their nakedness. And so they make coverings. And then what do they do next? Right? They hide. They hide from God as they're ashamed of God, the one who made this garden to be with them and whose presence to be in. Now we see them naked, afraid of each other, and ashamed of to be near God. And they're hiding. Right? The God who created them, who loved them, their Father, gave them everything, enjoyed the creativity of their minds. Now they're hiding from him. So Adam and Eve, we leave them at this place where they're naked and they're ashamed. And the reality of their new life is a life that's lived under a curse. Right? God brings them out. We heard this last week. And he brings out Adam and Eve and the snake. And he tells them this is what happens because of your sin, right? And he said to Eve, pain in childbirth. For Adam, the ground was cursed, right? No longer would food come easily out of the ground. He would have to work and toil and sweat for anything that came for him for substance, right? Work wasn't a part of the curse, right? We know they worked and they took care of the garden before, but now their work would be one that wouldn't be enjoyable, right? It would be pain, thorns and thistles. It would be sweat as they worked the ground. And so they're now living under this curse. And also we learned that they will now die. They will now die. Although they were created to live forever, now physically and spiritually, Adam and Eve would experience death. Now, I heard Matt give this analogy with the kids, and I thought it was great. That they're like your cell phone, right? That it was plugged in, and when it's plugged in to its source, right, you could run it forever as it's plugged into the wall. But once you unplug that, it doesn't die immediately. But over time, no matter how you are, how reserved you are with using it, how little you touch the buttons, at some point, that phone inevitably is going to run out of batteries. That's the same with Adam and Eve. That no matter how careful they are with what they ate, right, fruits and vegetables only, or right much of nuts and different things, no matter how they ate or did or lived their life, now they would die physically. And then also they would be dead spiritually, cut off from the source of life, which is God. And that was their condition. The condition was under the cursed. And in most stories, this is where it ends, right? Adam and Eve got what they deserved. The snake got what he deserved. And that's it. It's a sad ending, but not in an ending where God's involved, right? That's not his character. That's not the character of our true loving Father. And it doesn't end there, right? He gives, wrapped up inside of that curse, right? Wrapped up in the hardship, there was a hope. It was a hope. And it was a hope for the future. And that God promised that one day, right, out of the seed or out of Adam or Eve's descendants, out of Eve's descendants is going to come a rescuer. And that this rescuer was and is the hope for the world. This is the rescuer. This is where they need to put their trust and their hope in. And it's this first little glimmer, and it's not a huge thing. It doesn't say a lot, but it's so impacting that the rest of our stories are going to either echo, they're going to whisper, or they're going to yell and shout out the name of this rescuer. That this is the pivotal moment of our story. So the rescuer was and he is the hope for mankind. So today, if you would for me, go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Genesis 6. So we're going to hover, we have actually quite a bit to cover. We're going to hover between chapter 4 and we're going to go all the way through chapter 9. But we're going to read, we're just going to kind of drop into the text at different portions and read what God has to say. And so if you want to go ahead and turn to Genesis 6, we'll start there. But what happens when there's no rice? And we ask that question. For you guys, you're like, whatever, we eat potatoes. But we asked that question quite a bit when we were first on Barangona in the Philippines. What happens when there's no rice? What happens when you guys run out of rice? What do? You know, a culture that eats it breakfast, lunch, and dinner. What do you do when it runs out? And their answer to us was, well, we eat korot. And they're like, korot? What's korot? And they would describe it, and we could never quite get what this korot was. Until one day they showed us, because on the island there was an infestation of rats. Like rats just came in, and by the thousands, they wiped out huge crops of rice. And so the people had to go to this root called a korot root. And it happened, korot is actually just springs up. All right, they don't plant it, they don't do anything to it, but it just springs up in the ground. And it usually comes in the coconut groves, so underneath the coverings of the coconut leaves, this plant or this yam, this tuberous type thing pops up. And we didn't really understand just how important this korot was, because it was more than just emergency food in starvation, that this was actually salvation for them during times of starvation. Like when they could starve, they always had korot. But the drawback to this korot was that korot, if you don't prepare it right, it's poison. So there's actually stories during World War II where Japanese soldiers observe Filipinos gathering this karot in the jungles when they wouldn't have had time to plant rice. And the Japanese soldiers thought, hey, this is what they eat. And so they began to eat karot either raw or prepared the wrong way, and they died. There's many, many stories of that happening during World War II. But the right way to prepare this karot is you actually have to, our people would grate it. So they'd peel off the outer level, and then they'd grate the karot into these fine, like, shavings. And then they'd go ahead and wrap it, squeeze out any juice they could get out of it, and then they'd tie a rock, so they'd wrap it in a T-shirt or something, and then they'd tie a rock to it, and they'd throw it in the ocean. So in the salt water, the salt was important. And then they'd leave it there, sometimes up to 6 days, sitting out in the ocean. And then they'd take it back in, wring it out, and then they'd find a fresh body of water. So usually this is during rainy season, so there's a small river on our island, and they would stick it in the fresh water. And it'd be another like 3 days that they'd have to stick it in the fresh water. And then they'd repeat the process, back in the ocean, back in the salt, in the fresh water, and they'd pull it out, and then they'd cook it up. But if you didn't do this, if you didn't do this exact process, right, this specific way, karot was poisonous. It was poison. So when you saw this and you looked at it, it's more than just karot, right? Like this for them was salvation during hard times, salvation during a disaster. So as we continue our story today, we come to this section that gives us insight into how God rescues. In the same way that this karot rescued the people on Barangunan during a hard time. The ark, so we're going to read about Noah's ark or God's ark. The ark in the same way was a very specific way in how God saved Noah, or those who put their trust in him. And so today we're going to look at the themes that are woven through this part of the story are God, man, sin, death, whispers of Christ, and faith. Then you have to think put yourself into Noah or to Adam and Eve's shoes as they left the garden. Right? We'll jump back to kind of the beginning of this story. But you have to, if you put yourself in their shoes, you have to think this idea of a rescuer. Right? It just rang in their heads as they were working, as they were tilling the soil, as they were walking through, felt the needles in the jungle as those thorns poked into their feet. You had to think that this idea of the rescuer, or the hope of the rescuer, just burned in their minds. And Eve, we see Eve gives birth in chapter 4 to a boy named Cain. And there's an inclination in the text there that actually Eve thinks, could this be the rescuer? Is this the one? And you got to also think that even the angels, as they looked down and observed, they think, maybe, is this the one? Is this the rescuer that God promised? Could it be? And then we see another son is born, Abel. And possibly the same question rings in their mind. Is it Abel? Is he the one that's going to rescue us? And that question is just smashed as later on in the story, Cain and Abel are out in the fields talking. Not sure what they're saying. But they're out talking, and Cain kills his brother. Right? He murders Abel. And so, as the angels looked on, they had to be saying, it's definitely not Cain and it's not Abel, but who is it? And not only was Cain not the rescuer, but Abel was not either. So, and from the moment that sin entered into the world in chapter 3, we can trace as mankind goes on this downward spiral, right? Started out with Adam and Eve, and then through Cain and Abel, it just goes on this downward spiral. And we can trace that in chapter 3. So Adam, when he sinned, what was he? He was ashamed, wasn't he? He hid. With Cain, when Cain kills his brother, there's a scene where God comes to Cain and says, Cain, where's Abel? And Cain's response isn't, I messed up. What's Cain's response? What? Am I my brother? Am I supposed to watch out for him? Right? It's one of indignance. Right? It's moved from shame and his father to now he's talking with God. Right? Cain is speaking with God. It's not a question of does God exist? Where is he? Where's God in bad times? Right? None of these questions exist. Cain is speaking with God, and Cain is indignant toward God. Right? What do you mean, where is my brother? Am I supposed to watch him? And then we begin in chapter 3. Chapter 4, they keep tracing this line of Cain. And we come to a man named Lamech. And Lamech was even worse than Cain. He actually has 2 wives, and we don't know if this was the beginning of collecting wives, if this was where they started to have more than one, not sure. All we know is Lamech had 2 wives, and he boasts, he brags to his wives about his sin. Right? He said, a young man brushed me, and I killed him. I killed him. Right? And if Cain's revenge is 7-fold, Lamech says, mine is 77-fold. And so we've moved from being ashamed of sin to being indignant about sin. And then finally now we see Lamech arrogant. In his sin, his arrogance shines. Right? It wasn't the question of who was God. It wasn't any of those things. It was that we know who God is, and I'm shaking my fist at him. It was a defiance. And that's the way that mankind begins to roll. And this downward spiral we see take hold. Now there is a ray of hope, because Adam and Eve had another son named Seth. And Seth is actually, in Kuyuna we say, the Lisan. He's the one that would replaced Cain and Abel. Right? And we see this contrast between Abel's line and Cain's line. And they have their descendants scattered out there, and they show how that traces through. Where Abel, we see a remnant of those who believed and still walked with God. But through Cain, we see the real story of the entire world, spun out of control in defiance and direct disobedience to God. So grieved, and at this point, I think we see in chapter 6 where Satan views what is happening. And I believe that Satan makes this attack on the seed of Eve. Okay, knowing that the Redeemer is going to come out of the line of Eve. Right? This is the one who's going to crush his head. He's heard the curse. He knows what's going to happen. He knows the hope that Adam and Eve have. And so his attack on this line, it was a satanic attack, is that Satan's angels, in chapter 6 there we see this, that Satan's angels, the ones who followed him down, his demonic beings, either take possession of men's bodies or they actually become men themselves, take the form of man, but somehow they have offspring with human women. And they defile an aspect of the human race. With hatred in their hearts, these angels appear to produce offspring with mortal women. And the result is a polluted race characterized by abuse, by strife, and by opposition to God. What a bleak picture of the world at that time. Opposition, direct defiance in opposition to God. And so the first thing that we see, this first emotion that comes out of God is grief. Or we see God grieved at his world, and he decides to blot mankind off the face of the world, cleansing this earth of its satanic attack. And as the angels look down, you can imagine, again, if we can just kind of step back and think from their perspective. As they look down, they must have been thinking, what in the world is happening? Right? What is God doing? Was there still any hope for a rescuer in the midst of all this chaos? Let's pick up in Genesis 6:5, verses 5 through 7. So the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of his thoughts, of his heart, was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man who I have created from the face of the land, man and animal and creeping things, and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. So at this point, enters a man named Noah, right? And it says in verse 8 there, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So this is our first time we experience Noah, and he pops onto the scene here. And Noah is described as someone who is blameless in God's sight, right? That he believed God and he walked with him. And then the story unfolds where God lets Noah in on his plan. He lets Noah in on what he is going to do. And he tells Noah of this impending punishment that is going to come on the world that he created. And then he also tells Noah specifically how he can be saved. Right? He tells him, this is what's coming. This is the judgment. But Noah, this is how you can be saved. Let's read Genesis 6. We're going to go to verse 13. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through men. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourselves an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length is going to be 300 cubits, about 450 feet. Its breadth, 50 cubits, about 75 feet. And its height, 30 cubits, about 45 feet. Make a roof for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with a lower, a second, and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth, and destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. So we see where God begins to specifically tell Noah of how he's going to be rescued. Right? He doesn't give him, hey, Noah, just make something that floats, hold on to it real tight. There's going to be some water. Right? He doesn't give him general things. Right? He's specific. He's like, this wide. I want it to be this tall, this long. Okay, this many floors. I want you to put one door in the ark. Right? This isn't just a general way of, hey, how to avoid the flood. No, this is a specific rescue plan. This is the one way in which Noah has to put his hope. It has to be in this ark, because this is what God provided. No other way. Has to be in this ark. And during this time, Noah didn't just sit around, right? He built the ark, but he didn't just do that. We know from other portions of Scripture, specifically 2 Peter and Hebrews 11, that Noah was a herald of righteousness. All right? In other words, he was out there as he built the ark. I'm sure people came around and, what are you doing? And he began to say, hey, God is going to judge the world. Right? You need to come back into relationship with him. Right? Move away from where you were. Come back. And when a time comes when God tells us, enter this ark with me. Right? Noah was a herald. He was proclaiming this judgment of God and then how to be saved. So during this time, as people came by, this is what Noah was up to. He was imploring. And as they finished the ark, this picture in the Bible tells us of the animals begin to come. Right? And God begins to bring animals to Noah, and they enter the ark. Right? So Noah made this ark with enough floors, the rooms, and specifically designed for himself and these animals. And as the animals come by and begin to enter the ark, a male and a female, you had to think that this was also a testimony to those living near Noah. Right? Would it be odd for you as someone builds an ark? Yeah, that's odd for one. And then these animals begin to come. I mean, for me, that would be a testimony, but you also think of the hardness of heart during that time. And we could say even in our time as well. But as these animals come, maybe there was explanations that, well, it's just because, Noah cast some spells on them, or maybe they had different explanations. But the point is, none of this did anything to sway the minds of those people around Noah. And so God tells Noah finally to enter the ark. Bring your family and go in. And Noah was about 600 years old at this time. And God says, Noah, get in the ark. Go in the ark by the door, right? There was no back way, no emergency exit, no window that was low enough to sneak in, right? There was a door, and it was put in the ark to go in to the ark. And that's the way God told him to go into. One way, one ark, one way of salvation. And then we read in Genesis 7, 15 and 16. Let's just turn there. We're all the way up to 7. And in 15, they went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was breath of life. And those that entered, male and female, of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. And then the Lord shut him in. Okay, so who closed the door? God closed the door. Noah didn't say, hey, anybody else? Our last chance. Right? God was the one who determined the time when things would happen. And it was God who closed the door, the one way in. And at that point, the Bible used this language, and he says, like the windows of heaven opened. Right? So the rain began to fall, and they said the windows of heaven opened, and it was almost like things were just gushing out. The water was gushing out. And the fountains of the deep, they burst forth, and flood waters came and rose up and covered the entire earth. Okay, the tallest mountain at that time, we don't know what that was, but the Bible tells us it was at least 22 and a half feet over that tallest peak. So this wasn't a localized flood just in some valley that wiped out a few different people groups. No, this is an entire worldwide flood covering the very highest peak in the earth. And so God scrubbed clean the world of this satanic attack. And then we see the flood subsiding, right? It begins to settle. Noah sends out a dove. The first one comes back. Then he sends out another, and finally the doves don't come back. And so Noah knows, hey, it's safe to go out. And so him and his family, they begin to step, and they go down this ramp or open the doors, and they enter this world that has been scrubbed clean, right? A new start. His family begins then to make offerings to the Lord, and it says God made a covenant with Noah at that time. Right? He says he hung a rainbow in the sky to say that he will never destroy the earth with a flood again. And it's kind of interesting here, just to take a step back, and you see these character qualities of God, right? These character things, and I think that's the biggest joy as we look through these stories, is we get to see God's character come out. But we also see Satan's character, right? We see he is the adversary. Everything that God wants, he wants to destroy. Anything God created, he wants to wreck. On our island, and I think in the Philippines in general, there's a saying that you can't point or look at a rainbow. And in our island, it's this is serious stuff. So if there's a rainbow in the sky, they're all looking like this because this is what their ancestors have told them. These are what the spirits have told them not to do. And no one will point at it. Right? And so taking something that God put there as a promise of hope and assurance for us, in our area, they've twisted that around so they can't even look at it. Right? He doesn't want even them to look at this stuff. And so you begin to see his character. And in the end, we find that although the world is wiped clean, right, sin still remains. Right? This satanic attack is wiped clean, but sin still remains. There's a weird little story at the end of chapter 9. I know some of you probably read it and just skipped over it, and you just kind of scratch your head, where Noah comes out of the ark and he begins to till the soil, right? He becomes a farmer, and he plants a vineyard, right? And then he gets drunk. And then he gets drunk and he's naked, and he's laying there in his tent naked, and then his son walks in backwards and flips some coverings over him, right? And I've always sat there and scratched my head and like, why in the world is this, tail end the story of Noah? And I think it does a few things. Number one, sin still exists, right? It didn't wipe the world. There's still a need for the rescuer. It didn't wipe the world of sin. We leave Noah in the same place that we left Adam, right? We left Adam naked and ashamed and in the need of a rescuer. And here at the end of the story of Noah, we leave Noah in the same place. We leave Noah in the place where he's naked, right? He's ashamed. And Noah is in the need, desperately needing God's rescuer. This is the end. We flew through those chapters, right? We've still got about 3 minutes left. And we flew through those chapters. But there's a few things I want to just go back to and point out, because there's a lot here, right? There's a lot. We could just hover in these few chapters for a long time. But a few things to point out. Number one, God punishes the evil, but he rescues the righteous. Right? Of all the people on the earth, God knew. Right? Noah, he knew Noah was in stark contrast to those people living at that time. And that God rescued Noah, but punished the rest of the world. So God rescues the righteous, but punishes the evil. Right? He also punishes the evil with the same force that he rescues the righteous. Right? With this worldwide flood, and we saw him do it. So those people who are like Cain and who act with indignance toward God will be subject to his wrath. It's a stark contrast, rescuing the righteous, but at the same time, he punishes the wicked. The second thing I want to bring out is that God closes the door. Right? He gives man a season of choice. During the flood story, it was about 120 years. So at the time of this satanic attack, God makes a proclamation that he's not going to let this go on longer than 120 years. Noah comes on the scene, and maybe 70 of those years, he's building the ark. But during this time was a season of choice for mankind. God had said what he was going to do. Noah proclaimed it. The ark showed it. The animals coming. There was enough evidence that they can choose to follow God. It was a season of choice. But at the same time, God is the one who chooses when the doors close. He's the one who chooses. And that's true for us as well, isn't it? There's a season of choice. We can respond to God in obedient faith the same way Noah did while we're living. But there's a point when we all will expire. And the door will close on our lives. And the time to make the choice, the season of choice, is while we're living. And so if we can remember and see this from the story, is that God's the one who does it. He's the one who closes the doors. And he gives man a season of choice. And finally, I think the big point here is we see that God is the one who provides salvation. And that salvation is found in God's way only. A very specific way. Right? In the Old Testament stories, can you tell me what Noah looks like? Like, what color hair did Noah have? What about Moses or Adam? Do we know if they had a long nose, short nose? What color skin? Right? We don't know. Right? Because that wasn't important. It wasn't specific. And so the Bible doesn't zero in on it. But how big was the ark? How long? How tall? Was there pitch? How was it covered? How was it waterproofed? Right? We know it was very specific. Right? And in the same way, this is the way that God saves. Right? He saves in a specific way. It was through the one door. It was through the ark. There was no hovercraft on the side. There was no logs lashed together. Right? There was no other way for salvation. It was only through the way that God provided. It was very, very specific. And so as we continue with these stories, continue to think about that. God's rescuer, it started out where we just know a few things. But as we progress on, this idea of the rescuer, who he'll be, what he'll be like, it gets very, very specific. Because in the same way that Noah was to enter the ark to be saved, the rescuer is the salvation for us, for Noah as well. So the rescuer is very specific. God's way is very specific. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do just thank you for your love for us. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the story of Noah. We thank you that you just show us so much about your rescuer, about your plan, about the way that you save. We ask that you would Just prick our hearts if there's those here who don't know you yet, that they would understand that this is the season of choice that you've given them. And that's that you would implore them to choose you. Again, we thank you for your word. We thank you so much that you love us. We thank you that you provide salvation. We love you in your name. Amen.